Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Day in History, our nightly look back at a specific day in history, where we take a look back at that day, examine the historical events of that day, the historical context in which those events took place, and the historical ramifications of those events. We also take a look at some people that were born on that day and some people that died on that day. And at the end of the video, I'm going to have a special message for everyone. So, without further ado, this day in history, March the 14th. And on this day, in 1967, early in the morning hours, the body of JFK was moved to the permanent gravesite at Arlington National Cemetery. Presidents, unlike most of us, usually have not only a gravesite picked out, most people have a burial spot picked out, but presidents actually have the whole site fixed up. All that's left to do is install the headstone. Ronald Reagan had a pre-constructed one. George H.W. Bush. I'm assuming some other presidents since then have done the same. I know that other presidents who have died previously have done the same. Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson was buried in his family plot in Texas by the Pedernales River. But JFK was assassinated in a sudden way. At first, it was suggested he would be buried in Boston next to one of his deceased sons, but that was quickly squashed when Mrs. Kennedy had recounted a story about her husband telling her about a beautiful spot in Arlington Cemetery that he said he could wish he could spend the rest of his life. He had only visited it a few days before. And they quickly got to work, and they buried him in a site very close to where he's buried at now. And over the course of the years, constructed what is the site today of his burial site in Arlington National Cemetery. And the burial vault was taken up out of the ground. It was viewed by his brothers, Senator Robert Kennedy and Senator Ted Kennedy, and lowered into the new grave. The burial vault was not opened. This has occurred a few times. Of course, most famously, Abraham Lincoln. Of course, they did open his casket because people tried to steal his body, and they needed to see if they were successful in stealing his body. But Kennedy was moved to the site of his permanent grave today, where the eternal flame is. First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy joined him at that burial site after her death. The children that died prematurely have been moved there. His brother Robert Kennedy and brother Ted Kennedy are buried feet away in simple graves marked by a single cross. In fact, there are few of the actual crosses in Arlington. Almost every headstone in Arlington is a simple white headstone adorned with whatever faith emblem that person practiced. Star of David, the Christian cross, the crescent of the Muslim faith, Buddhist symbols. There's even a symbol for atheists, and it can be unmarked. But that is something interesting that happened on this day. And I've actually had the honor of visiting President Kennedy's gravesite, and it is quite moving. because it is a very beautiful sight. You look out over Washington, D.C., and you can see the nation's capital, and it truly is a great view of the city, and just an awe-inspiring place to be in the presence of all those people, many of whom gave their last ounce of devotion to this country in war, many who went on to live distinguished lives after their service. And of course, we have many people in that cemetery who were our nation's leaders in addition to their military service. There's several Chief Justices buried there. And another president of the United States is actually buried in Arlington. And when I visit Arlington later this year, I am going to not only visit President Kennedy's gravesite, I'm going to visit the gravesite of that other president who's buried there that probably does not get as many visitors as President Kennedy does, and that is President Taft. So, just if you're ever in Washington and have the opportunity to go to that hallowed ground, I urge you, go see the changing of the guard. It is one of the most awe-inspiring and captivating things you can see. Just amazing. The dignity with which they perform that ceremony. President Kennedy's gravesite, go see President Taft. And also, go to a simple section and walk among the headstones and pay your respects. John Glenn is buried there. Go see his grave. Go see, pick a leader from history who served in the military. Look up and see if they're buried at Arlington, and go visit their gravesite. Some births that occurred on this day. In 1854, Thomas Marshall was born. Marshall served as vice president from 1913 to 1921. He was born in North Manchester, Indiana. You should definitely know Thomas Marshall's name, and he should actually have been a president. Thomas Marshall served as Woodrow Wilson's vice president. And after Wilson suffered his stroke, that Mrs. Wilson kept the severity of it a secret from everyone, including Marshall. He basically finished his term as an invalid. Wilson did. And Marshall should have become president. And if the 25th Amendment had been around when Wilson was president, Marshall would have become acting president. I think it was a disservice to this country what Edith Wilson did. Thomas Marshall should have had the opportunity to serve as acting president because Woodrow Wilson was in no capacity to lead. And that's really a shame. Marshall became the first vice president since Daniel Tompkins, nearly a century beforehand, to serve 2 complete terms in office. Tompkins served between 1817 and 1825 during the presidency of James Monroe. There's a couple of reasons why this occurred. One was we had a lot of presidents that would, during that time, that were either assassinated or dropped dead because Washington, D.C. was just a petri dish of cholera and all sorts of things during that time. So when the president would pass away, the vice president would move on up to the presidency, and the vice presidency during that time would stay vacant. Also, you would have a lot of vice presidents as well, for the same underlying reasons. Washington, D.C. was not the most conducive city to long lives at that time. Also, the health care system in this country was not what it is today then. And they would die. And also, vice presidents at that time were politically expendable. They could be replaced on the ticket at a whim. And yes, no one really cared. So Marshall had a lot of dark humor about the office. He had this saying, a woman had two sons. One went to sea, and the other became vice president, and neither of them were heard from again. He said, it says Indiana's the home of us presidents. Never has a state produced more second-class men ever. I mean, he had a lot of dark humor about this office. And in my opinion, that was a lot of bitterness about the fact that he had been had been so slighted in this attempt to take over. Some deaths that occurred on this day. I am not going to spend long on this because I do not want a holy war breaking out in the comments. Karl Marx died on this day in 1883 at the age of 64 in London. Marx is the father of communism. He was a German-born political philosopher, economist, historian, and sociologist, and social revolutionary. Marx, whatever your political beliefs are, is one of the most important and influential men to ever walk this earth. His theories have been controversial from the start and have been profound and very consequential. No one can argue that Karl Marx's political theories and philosophies did not have a profound impact on this world and had profound ramifications to this day. I'm not saying that his views were 100% right or wrong, but Karl Marx had a profound effect on the world you live in today, whether you realize it or not. And that is worth remembering. He was alive and was a person. For good or evil. I will let the viewers decide. As I said, I don't want a holy war breaking out in my comments. So, I will see you all tomorrow. Now, my special announcement. We are living, as I record this video, in probably one of the most consequential times in human history. The coronavirus is a very serious issue that we are facing as a world at this moment. We all need to come together and take the advice of the scientists on this and listen to the public health officials. If they say don't go out, don't be interacting, don't have large crowds, do this when you sneeze, wash your hands often, use soap, hand sanitizer if you can get it. Don't hoard products. Do that. We can get through this together. And I have every confidence that if we listen to the public health officials and the scientists, we will look back on this and say, wow, it was bad. But it could have been a whole lot worse if we didn't follow their advice. So please, if you are exposed to someone with it, practice social distancing, self-isolate yourself. If you are exposed to someone or the disease, or the virus, get a test. And please check on the elderly. They're very susceptible to this. See y'all tomorrow.